So happy to have you along once again. We are joined as always by Greg Engert, beer director for the Neighborhood Restaurant Group, which includes Where We Are, Church Key, Downstairs, Birch and Barley. Greg, a food and wine sommelier of the year. Great as always to see you.
Too. What
is on tap this week? This is looking promising to start right out. Four beers.
So it's actually interesting. We have we're tasting a beer from the 961 beer company. They're out of Lebanon, nestled in the hills near Beirut. And this brewery is launching in the United States. Just happened this week. We had a little event with them earlier this week at Church Key with the founder, Mazen Hajar. He came over, and they make great beers. So they're launching with 4 beers in bottle, and that's what we have here. And then 1 beer on draft, that's what we're tasting here. So this is the Pale Ale. And this is probably the most distinctive and Lebanese of all of their creations. I think you'll taste why in a second. It's really herbaceous.
That is good. That is different.
It's different. Yeah. So it's basically a kind of an English pale ale base to it. It's got good malt sweetness up front, nice hop dryness in the finish. But the kicker is that he's employing lots of different Lebanese herbs and spices. Zadar is probably the most famous kind of spice blend. It has sesame seed, sumac, which is a little bit tart, and then dried herbs like thyme. That's a traditional accompaniment for Lebanese cuisine, and he's added that delicately to the beer. It's well integrated, so it gives it a kind of a very Lebanese character, and also makes it really flavorful. It accentuates the hop floral qualities as well.
Now, they've got some great Lebanese restaurants here in the D.C. area, and they serve a Lebanese lager I've seen a lot. But what is the craft beer scene in Lebanon like? Are these guys it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, this is the craft beer scene in Lebanon, and actually this is probably one of the most well-known up-and-coming craft breweries from the Middle East in general. So, you know, we were talking about earlier how when you go to a foreign country, typically the beer scene is dominated by 1, maybe 2 macro lager producers. And actually, we see a lot of Lebanese macro lager, even in the States. It's Almaza. So for 961 Beer to come out and be making these really full-flavored craft beers is distinctive, not just for Lebanon, but for the Middle East. 961 is the name because that is the international calling code for Lebanon.
Oh, okay.
And Mazen started this back in 2006 as a kind of a home brewing hobby, so to speak, with his friends. And before that, he had very successful businessmen. So we got to parlay to success into starting 961. And when you look at their lineup, they actually it's cool, they even make a lager. But it's one that's much more craft brewed, fuller flavored, more malt biscuity sweetness to it, a little bit of a floral dryness in the finish. So they even make a kind of craft alternative to the macro beers you see from the Middle East.
What is his inspiration? Did he start out getting into Belgian beers, or was it American craft beers that he got turned on to, or something completely different?
It seems like it's American craft kind of generally, but it's cool. It's kind of a throwback to what craft beer was in the beginnings. You know, the early craft brewers started off all with a pale ale, an IPA, you know, a porter. And so he has a porter here, which is delicious, 5.6%. He's got a nice lager, as I mentioned. His red ale is actually based on like kind of a mildly hoppy American red ale, so it's got Amarillo hops. Most of the hops that he uses in all of his beers are from the Pacific Northwest, so definitely an American inspiration, with the exception, I guess, of the wit beer, which is, you know, inspired more by beers like Hoegaarden and the like.
Now, you know, if you see this beer in the stores around here, that it's very fresh. That's the great thing about it just being newly arrived.
Right.
But that made me think of, what does a beer go through to get from Lebanon or from Holland or from Germany or Belgium? Are they flown, cargo ship? I mean,
yeah.
What sort of damage, or maybe damage is the wrong word, but impact, if any, is made on the beer that might be negative,
well,
if that makes any sense?
It makes a lot of sense, actually, and that's one of the interesting things about imports today. I mean, at one point, because craft beer in America wasn't where it is obviously today, we had to turn to imports for an alternative to that kind of macro lager.
Right.
So even if that beer had been traveled for long periods of time and long distances, by the time it got here, it may not have been in the best shape, but it still promised a flavor experience we weren't getting from our American beers. And so, to your point, 961 beer gets brewed, craft brewed in Lebanon, near Beirut. It's probably trucked to port and then shipped overseas, maybe even making stops along the way. Comes to America and then gets trucked to a distributor and then to us. So there's a lot of time in between. I mean, it's not unlikely for a beer to take 6 weeks even sometimes to get here from overseas. So typically now, when I see imported beer, I like it better when it's on draft because kegs are impervious to light. With here you're going to get some light striking these bottles. Now, granted, they're brown bottles. They're not green. Green bottles are really bad. Lots of UV gets through and they can skunk the beer. So brown bottles are better. But you get some light here. You can get the beer can get heated up. It can oxidize. Draft keeps it much better for longer periods of time. And so if I'm seeing 961 beer, I'm going to look for it on draft first. And then when I go to bottles, I'm going to look probably for the beers that are sturdier and richer. So like the porter would be my take if I had a selection, in the near future of 961. I'd probably go for the porter, knowing that because it's dark and a little bit stronger and richer, it's going to taste more like it does in Lebanon once it gets here than maybe, say, the lager would.
We'll give you the email if you'd like to ask Greg a question in a moment, but before I forget, and I have forgotten before, what would you pair this with?
Oh, yes.
Lebanese food.
Right, yeah, I was going to say, the thing is, for the pale ale, I think that's right. Now, sometimes I get a little bit nervous when people automatically say that if a beer is from someplace, it goes with their dish, just because a lot of times, like we were just talking, I mean, it could be just your fizzy yellow lager from someplace. That doesn't necessarily go best with Lebanese cuisine. But in this case, with the beer that we're drinking right now, because of that amazing herbaceous note, I mean, it's seasoned like a Lebanese dish. It is going to be great to have alongside something a little bit more restrained like hummus or even baba ganoush, tabbouleh, shawarmas, things like that. It's going to be excellent because it's bringing in similar flavors, but in many cases, it's going to be bringing in additional flavors. Za'atar, that blend of sesame seed and dried thyme and herbs and sumac, something that's used to season all sorts of Lebanese dishes, including breakfast dishes. So in some ways, if you think of this as kind of a Za'atar-inspired beer, we can season dishes with it.
I mean, I think people, everyone's taste preferences are different. Maybe this won't become your favorite beer of all time, but you really should try it because it's
distinctive.
Unique.
Yeah.
Yes,
it's
but not in a what did you put in it sort of way.
And also, it doesn't just taste like a tincture of Lebanese cooking herbs. It has a malt sweetness. It has a nice hop bitterness. It's definitely a craft beer with nuances of Lebanese cuisine.
All right, if you've got a question for Greg, remember the email is beeroftheweek@WTOP.com. Greg, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Everyone, please always do drink responsibly, and be sure to bring your thirst next time for another Beer of the Week.